Hello, everyone. This is Denny Miller, and welcome to Indy 500 Yesteryear and Today with Speedway Insiders Paul Page, Bob Gates. And this has always been a goal of this show to have celebrity guests appear periodically, and we're delighted to have the distinguished Mark Dill, probably the foremost authority of early Indy 500, and an author of a book which we'll be giving you a chance to tell about. And you're kind of the Ray Haroon of our show there, Mark, to be able to be our first guest. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you.
Bob, I think you have a copy of his book. Tell us a little bit about that, and we'll let you tell about your book then, Mark. But thank you for being our first guest.
Yeah, and first I want to dispel any rumors that I saw the 1911 race. The older I get, the more young people.
Broke my heart.
No, thank you for the opportunity.
I've lost your audio.
Can anybody else hear me?
I can hear you. Can you see? What can you see?
I see all three of you and myself.
Okay.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about my book, and it was just an inspiration and it's just a passion. I felt like it was something that had to come out of me. And the interesting thing about it, the subtitle, the battle for the soul of American auto racing, I don't think anybody before me has connected the dots, but there's a thread there in terms of the cultural struggle that was going on. And in fact, I know Donald Davidson knows this. I don't know how many people know this, but there was actually a kind of a CART IRL civil war in those early days. There was the AAA, of course, and then there was the Automobile Club of America, and they were rivals, and it was messy. And anyway, they came out of it. But there's just a lot going on at that time. And when I say cultural, I mean, you had people in the Northeast that were, the voices of authority. And then you had these people they called Westerners, and they were characters like Fisher and the Founders and Barney Oldfield. And so there was a true cultural difference, and that's what this battle was all about. And I try to tell that story.
And where can people get your book, Mark?
Well, if you want an autographed copy, go to markgdill.com. That's my author's site, and I'll be happy to sign it and send it to you. And other than that, all the major online retailers like Amazon, Target, Walmart, I don't know, a couple of others. I got a note which was really cool and totally unexpected from an outfit called Blackwell's in England, started selling it. So all of that to me is just a wonderful compliment.
Let me try to hold up this kind of a crude way of displaying the book, and
Looks beautiful to me.
Apologize for that, but this is Mark's book. And I've read the book, very good book. It just brings to life those characters from the turn of the century auto racing and of course, Indianapolis, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway that we're all so interested in. So, people like Carl Fisher, James Allison, Barney Oldfield, all those people really come to life in Mark's book. It's a very, very well done book. I had a question, if I might, probably jumping out of our agenda a bit for Mark, if I can start it off. And that's, how did you get interested in this era of racing, Mark?
I don't know. Maybe I had it in a previous life. I grew up in Indianapolis, and I really got crazy about the sport when I was 8 years old, and that was in 1963. And even though I raced myself, I did a lot of things, and I spent time in corporate. But I think about like my grandparents; they were born during that decade. And my dad would tell me stories. He wasn't that old, but he'd tell me stories from their generation. And I also have a fascination with Teddy Roosevelt, who was president through a good measure of that time. And I don't know, there's something that just tugs at me. I also like stories about entrepreneurs, and that's what those guys were. They built it.
Yeah.
And I think it's underappreciated, if I may say that, how all of us who love motorsports and have participated in it, we still stand on their shoulders.
Yeah.
They put the foundation there, and it's the same foundation we're building on today.
Very true.
Absolutely correct.
Paul and I had an over and under on which book you would hold up, Mark's or your Vukovich book, Bob. So I lost the bet on that. By the way, Mark, we dedicate this show.
There you go.
Hey, I'm just returning the favor.
Thank you, Mark.
We dedicate each of these episodes to the memory of Robin Miller, and Robin was one to do occasional over and under himself, and
Oh, yeah.
we keep him in our hearts, and we were glad we were able to do this show, and Mark, that you're the first. I have a question. Tell us about the founding fathers and their 4 personalities, and actually who would have been the 5th founder of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway that very few people know about. You share a little of that with us, please?
I kind of call that 5th founder, the 5th Beatle, the guy that was apparently going to be part of it and then backed out. He was a young man called Stoughton Fletcher, and everybody in Indianapolis has heard of the Fletcher family, and there's streets named after him, that. And he was just a young guy, I think early 30s. He's president of the bank, but he still had to answer to his dad and the board. And when he got hooked up with this guy that everybody thought was a bit of a crazy man, Carl Fisher, the board just didn't feel like it was appropriate for him as an officer of the bank to be associated with something so risky, and it was controversial with a lot of the personalities of the sport at the time. So he had to back out. And as far as the personalities, that was one thing, and it's hard to find a lot of good information on that, because that's under the covers. But I picked up fragments, and I talked to Donald Davidson, for example, and got some insights to these guys. And I think, again, that's undertold. You get this kind of a cardboard stand-up every May, 4 founders, and it's kind of trivialized. And obviously Carl was the man full of energy, and he did have crazy ideas, but he made things happen. Allison and he were tight friends and total opposites. I think it's pretty well documented. Allison grounded Fisher, and Fisher was always going to fire off the big idea, and then Allison figured out whether or not it was possible. And but Wheeler and Newby, I feel like Wheeler was kind of a black sheep and kind of full of bluster. And I think he kind of picked on Art. Art was different than the other guys, even though he was really tight with Fisher and they did bicycle racings. There was the Newby Oval in the 1890s. But he was a teetotaler, and he went to church, which the other guys didn't. And so I got the impression from just reading some things, Wheeler would kind of needle Newby, and Fisher didn't really like that. So, but anyway, that's a little more about their personalities than I think. They were individuals. They had all their human foibles and passions, whatever. And so these were real people. And that's, and I appreciate what Bob said. I mean, that's what I tried to do, is like, let's not just look at these guys as caricatures. They actually lived. And sometimes in spite of themselves, they did some important stuff.
We have a viewer that sent this email to me. His name is Rick Patterson from the Dayton, Ohio area. It says, I'm looking forward to the next show with Mark Dill. He is a great storyteller. Ask him about Cliff Luttrell. He was a Stoddard Dayton mechanic. The cars were stored at the Fisher plant prior to the 1909 race. Cliff was critically injured on the drive from the plant to the Speedway. That's a viewer wants to know that. Mark, you want to share?
Yeah, it was definitely a critical injury because it ended up being a fatality. And they were leaving from Carl's dealership. And, you know, all these guys, we think about them maybe, oh, they're way in the past, maybe they're old. They weren't old. These were like, a lot of them were kids. And Literal was with his buddies, and they were storing the cars at Fisher's dealership because Fisher sold a lot of Stoddard Daytons. So he welcomed them in, and Literal made the mistake of getting on top of the fuel tank, which was like a barrel. And then two other guys, one in the passenger seat or riding mechanic seat and the other one driving. And I don't know, I guess it was a jolt when he started it up, and Literal fell off the back, and a truck that was behind them ran over him.
Oh.
And it sounded, it had to be a horrible accident. And he did have wife and kids and all that, and he was a young man. And, you know, it was interesting because I think the newspapers at the time were trying to figure out how to report on just racing. And local papers tended to lump in that accident with the other fatalities that happened at the Speedway during that race meet. And well, that's not fair. It was a street accident.
Right.
It was loosely related to the races, but it wasn't at the track. So anyway, it's just an observation. I don't think they were trying to be fake news or whatever. They were just, these people were scratching their heads. What are these things? You know, what are these cars? And how do we talk about these races? You know, so they had some, if you read on my website, firstsuperspeedway.com, I've got like every article associated with the 1909 event, as well as other years, that was published by Indianapolis newspapers. And that's what I drew on to get this walk through time that Bob was talking about. And I mean, you read that stuff and it puts you there.
I just got a text I'm glancing at. Someone says, be sure to ask you about Thomas Kincaid. So
I like Thomas Kincaid. He was so talented, young man. And, you know, I don't know how many people have thought about it, but if Thomas Kincaid had not died in a practice session at the Speedway in July of 1910, he may have won the second Indy 500, because there was an opening on the national team, as we know, and because Marmon quit the sport after winning the first race, Joe Dawson, who was a Marmon employee, was loaned out to national. And but if Kincaid had been there, he was already on the national team, and he won 2 or 3 major races very young, I think 22 when that accident happened. And he's one of those guys like David Bruce Brown. You know, people in our generation will talk about like a Tony Renna. You know, he was just there, and then the worst thing happened. And similar with those guys, Spencer Wishart too. I mean, these were like incredibly talented young men. Easily could have been Indy 500 winners, and they all lost their lives. It was a dangerous sport then.
well, you can't believe this, Mark. The texts that are coming through for you. There's
Oh,
one
cool.
that says, be sure to ask you about the Wheeler suicide. But first, before you do that, I'm going to go back and forth with Paul and Also, Bob, I know they have some questions they'd like to ask of you as well. Paul, would you like to lead
Yeah,
off?
sure. Good to see
Hi,
you, Mark.
Good to see you.
I find Allison, or excuse me, Fisher, to be a thoroughly fascinating man. Not just for the Speedway. I mean, anybody that, like, from May to August, bricked the entire track or bricked the entire track. I mean, that was, he was the honcho on that. But I don't know how many people know about him helping create US 41 and everything that he did at Miami Beach. Can you elaborate on some of that?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just note too that I have all three biographies, Jerry Fisher, a distant relative, and another professor out of Miami, and then Fisher's wife, Jane. And in fact, I've got that book downloadable for free on firstsuperspeedway.com. But yeah, Fisher, that was a thing, and he's like the classic entrepreneur. He'd get bored once he built something, then he had to move on. And he was losing interest in the Speedway as early as 1916, 1917. And I think Allison was doing the heavy lifting. And then eventually Fisher just resigned as president, still on the board in 1923. And Allison then ascended to the presidency. And I'm not sure how many people know that. But yeah, he got involved with the Lincoln Highway. A couple of years ago, I was headed east for Tony Perella, the president of SVRA's wedding. And we decided, my wife and I, to drive through the Lincoln Highway. Much of it is still in place. And it's kind of fascinating. A lot of oddball historical landmarks remain from those very early days. But he built that. That was the first coastal, coast to coast transcontinental highway. And then later he built the Miami, the Dixie Highway, from Indianapolis down to Miami, which, Fisher worked every angle, and he wanted to have the snowbirds come down, and he was building up Miami, which was hugely successful until that hurricane. I forget exactly what year, I think 25. But just imagine, he tried to build a resort, and there's his fingerprints are still on Montauk in New York, the Hamptons area. But he had to withdraw while it was still incomplete, because with the disaster of the hurricane in Miami and trying to rebuild that, his finances finally became very taxed. Is that good enough?
Oh, yeah. And I love, as you call it, his entrepreneurship. He was, well, and we haven't even touched on all the bicycle things that he was doing as well. But he's an amazing man, amazing human being.
Yeah. So go ahead.
I was going to say, apologize. Typically, I look right into the camera, but this is unusual, Mark. You should feel real complimented. This is my third text coming in to ask you this question that says, if you can, talk about Allison's brief second marriage as well. So
well, yeah, I can talk about
if I
that.
get other things, I'm glancing at this, but this is new uncharted territory.
I can talk about
that. That popular.
But he, and I also want to say, there's so many people that have followed me on social media. I don't know them, but then I feel like I get to know them. And I told my wife the other day, it's just so many nice people, friendly. I mean, and they're interested, and you get to share information on Allison. Yeah, I mean, that's just one of those things. I said, these guys were just human beings, and they had their passions and their foibles and all that. And he had this long apparently successful marriage, but he had a secretary, I guess he thought was pretty cute, and divorced his wife and married her, and they went, I think it was out east. My mind's not working here, but he contracted pneumonia. He had a history of lung issues, and probably a lot of that was these guys smoked like 10 cigars a day. But he fell ill on the train ride back, and then he went in the hospital and passed away. So
I think he lived 5 days.
yeah, I mean,
on
I hope he had a lot of fun on those 5 days. That was a heavy price.
And I wrote the book on Eddie Rickenbacker's ownership of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, mainly covering 1928 to 1945, but I tell a little bit about that, and it really became intriguing in that the first wife loses everything that she would have had because second wife had it, and there became a court battle for that, which first wife lost. And then the mother of Jim Allison files a suit, and she wins. And there was a negotiated settlement where wife number 2 gets a little of something. I think maybe wife 1 gets something. And some of it was put into a charitable thing by Mrs. Allison. So
let me mention that there's a very nice lady, very intelligent woman who wrote a biography of James Allison, and her name's Sigurd Whitaker, and maybe you guys already know who she is. But as far as I know, that was the only biography book that was written about Allison's life, and it's a good read. And like I said, trying to get behind the facade of just this trivialized view of who these guys were, and then understand them as human beings. That book was helpful to do that. And she talks about that incident that you're talking about. I mean, the whole the death of Allison, and then also the court battles. So
Bob, what questions do you have for our distinguished guest?
Just listening, well, a couple of questions, really. One is about the families. Are there any of the 4 founding fathers' families still around? Fishers or Allisons or the Wheelers, the others?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Short answer is I don't believe so, but I really don't know. Like Wheeler had a son, and what kind of family did he create? Newby never married. Fisher, he and his wife Jane did have a child that unfortunately passed away within a week or so. Wheeler, Wheeler, I don't know. So, yeah, I mean, he had a son, but I don't know anything beyond that. It's a good question.
It just caught to my attention that, such great names, and especially around Indianapolis and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And just as far as the family, seems like their legacies are gone. But the other question I had was about Carl Fisher and his fortunes. I think he probably made and lost more than one. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and how wealthy was Carl at the height, maybe at the time he was the most wealthy, Mark?
Yeah, I can't remember the number. I have read it, but the main comment was he was one of the wealthiest men in America in the early 1920s. I mean, wow. He was big time. And but he was always putting it on the line, he could have, after they sold Prestolite, which is another amazing story, they made so much money off of selling that to Union Carbide. I mean, a lot of people, I know I would have just, taken off and amused myself, maybe write a book like this, but he couldn't sit still. and he'd put everything at risk. And the Miami hurricane really hurt. And then he, like many people, including Barney Oldfield, just got clobbered with the Great Depression, the stock market collapse. So at the end, though, I hear people say, oh, he died a pauper. He didn't die a pauper. He had a monthly stipend. And even though he wasn't a religious man, when he was in Miami, he built a church. And the minister there was very grateful and looked in on him and arranged for, they brought him food and all that. I mean, he was living maybe a much more mundane life, but it wasn't like he was homeless begging.
Right.
Since you brought up Prestolite, it's not there anymore, but it used to be so great. There was a smokestack across the Speedway, straight down the main straightaway. You could see it, and drivers would use the smoke off of that as kind of a reference. I don't know how good a reference it would be, but they say they use that. And then the other thing, Prestolite, of course, was a new technology headlight. And when they were bricking the Speedway to extend the possible hours, they set a whole bunch of them alongside the track to light up the work. I just thought that was so cool.
And they had done that before, not at the Speedway because it didn't exist, but in 1905, that pretty well-known, if you're versed in the history, event where they went out in November to the Indiana State Fairgrounds and two of Newby's cars, which Fisher also sold nationals. And they staged this 24-hour run, and one of the cars broke a steering knuckle and crashed, but the other one did it, set the new record, and it was all lit, as you say, Paul, by Prestolite, because obviously it had to run through the night. And just early days stadium lighting, I guess.
Thank you.
So another question, Mark, it just came in. They want to know if it's true that Carl Fisher was involved in as a race car driver in a fatal accident, that they heard that, but they don't know any of the details of it. I really don't know the details of it either. But I had heard one that he could hardly see because of poor eyesight, but he did attempt to be a race car driver. Would you share that?
Sure.
For Adam in that comment?
And I cover that in my book. I think it's actually a chapter. And that's just, again, another example of Fisher. I mean, the guy was so myopic, he really couldn't see very well. He didn't have glasses until 1910 or something, 1909, I guess. And yet he's out there driving cars as fast as just about anybody can. He set a world record at Harlem racetrack up near Chicago. So what you're referring to is an event at Zanesville in Ohio, and he had two racers built, and it was by the Mohawk Motorcycle Company, but they built these cars, and he and he had a partner who was a very gifted driver, and his name was Earl Kaiser. And I've got all this on my websites. If you want to go search Zanesville, Earl Kaiser, if you really want to read about it, it's all there. And it was actually Kaiser. I don't know what happened. The coverage doesn't tell you, but there was he lost control, or some malfunction, ended up crashing through the rails there, which were designed to guide horses in racing. And, it was just useless with cars, and plunged into a cluster of people. And also, as a side note, knocked over a chicken coop. And so there were chickens all, but they were never quite certain how many people were injured and frankly killed And the crowd became so unruly that they chased Fisher out of town. And he came to the accident, picked up Kaiser, who broke a leg, and his brother Earl was with him. And, it had to look like Keystone Cops, and they all just jump on this one remaining car. And the crowd's running behind him, throwing rocks at him, and he was able to, get away from them. But that was, it's unfortunate. And that happened on the same day, believe it or not, that Barney Oldfield was up in Michigan at Grosse Pointe and crashed through a fence and killed a gentleman, and his first name was Frank, and I can't think of it. But Frank and his brother were sitting, and that's where you got the phrase railbirds. They were sitting on the rail, which they had been told not to do, but they wanted to be close, and they sure got awful close. Anyway, Barney plowed through there, and unfortunately, this gentleman, Frank, was killed. He was killed instantly. So those two things, spectator deaths, happened on the same day.
Yeah. Wow.
Did Fisher consider running in the first Indy 500? Was there that pull and the marqueeness of this inaugural event that he
I think he got his
drive versus driving just the pace car?
No, there's no evidence of that, but he, again, talking about standing on their shoulders, and the very first use of a pace car, Carl Fisher, and I started dating. And so he got his jollies in that event by driving the pace car and really creating a tradition that has been embraced throughout motorsport.
Somewhat like the champagne spraying that Dan Gurney had initiated at Le Mans in 1967.
Yeah, it's a lot of, you do something good or entertaining, you're going to find a lot of copycats that will flatter you with their duplicating what you did.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing having one that goes back that far.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, like, for example, the checkered flag was first used in 1906, I believe, at the Vanderbilt Cup. And well, here we go. I mean, that ain't going to change.
No, I don't think so.
Another one, I'm really fascinated by this, Mark, that says, do you know anything about the Frank Wheeler ghost in his mansion?
No, I've heard people say, who knows? Frank had diabetes, and obviously there wasn't any insulin. And the best a doctor could do is try to suggest a diet, which he wanted nothing to do with, because he liked to drink, smoke cigars, and eat red meat. And that was what he and his buddies did, and he wasn't going to stop. And so it just got so bad. I think his feet were bleeding profusely and wouldn't heal. And he was a proud man, and it's like, no, I'm going to choose how I go out of this world. I'm not going to be bedridden and bleeding to death with cuts. So that was the kind of guy he was.
Another question. Tell about the hot air balloon and his automobile that flew over Indy.
Sure. And that was in October of 1908, and it was a big stunt. It wasn't known until a long time after that they had removed the engine from that car, because it was just going to be too heavy for the balloon to carry. and his brothers, he had two, Rollo and Earl, and they had gone ahead to about where Carl planned to land, and they had a duplicate car there. And I don't know exactly how he did it, but somehow he distracted the people that had followed him. And there were newspaper reporters there. But somehow he distracted them, and they ended up getting in the other car. And and people thought, well, that was a car, and he's going to drive it back to his shop. So I liked also, if I can insert, there's an amazing story, like in the first balloon race that I discovered in the course of writing this book. And again, it's documented on my firstsuperspeedway.com. He competed in that one and really had a near-death experience. He had a mentor by the name of George Bumbaugh, who actually created the balloon that he was in and was a very prominent, they called them aviators, but balloon pilots. And there was a thunderstorm, and of course Carl flew right into it. And then there was what they described as a vortex, and it just started spinning the balloon around and taking it to unfathomable heights in the day. And then the air pressure, the temperature and the air pressure changed, and the balloon started to rapidly deflate, and they're plunging. It just sounded very harrowing. And one of the things they did, they had a gas can. They didn't know it had been used for fuel, and that's what their water was stored in, and it was undrinkable. They quickly discovered that and decided, well, we need to descend and get some water. And Fisher even got out of the balloon. They rested the basket on a stack of railroad ties. He gets out of the balloon and goes under a tree and smokes a cigar. And then he gets back in it. And Bumbaugh's trying to say, you can't do this. I mean, it's over. We landed. And he was like, no, we were on the pylons, and and so he was trying to work that angle, and that didn't fly with the aviation officials. So yeah, I mean, hey, I'm off on a tangent, but you mentioned ballooning.
You mentioned Barney Ofield, and that's a name that lives on today. What made Barney Ofield such a star, if you would, back in that era?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I've thought about that in terms of how information shared today versus back then. And people don't realize information still traveled at 186,000 miles per second because they had telegraph and they had phones, and every newspaper office had a telegraph. And there were actually 32 telegraph operators at the first Indy 500 tapping out. Yeah, the reporters would come up, especially Associated Press. There was a special edition of the Los Angeles Times that had a break-in in the middle of the day telling people Ray Haroon was leading at 300 miles. But Barney, who basically hadn't really driven a car before, he had a friend, Tom Cooper, from bicycling days, and they were buddies. And in the book, it comes off sort of as Sundance and the Sundance Kid and his partner. They just had, I think they loved each other, and they had a really good time. And Cooper had an appendicitis, and that was a serious surgery, and it was taking him a while to recover from that. So he knew Barney. Barney had ridden motorbikes on board tracks. He knew Barney had a lot of guts. And so, okay, yeah, I'll get him in this car. I'll show him a few things. He'll go out. Well, anyway, it was a car that Cooper had built with Henry Ford. And it was about a year before Ford, he had established a company earlier, but it failed. And it was about a year before he founded the Ford Motor Company we know today. And that was really, some people argue with me, but I feel like that was the first Ford race car, and it was called the 999. And Fisher actually named it. That was a famous locomotive that had set the world record for speed. So it's like, well, this is a fast car. We want people to know. And anyway, he ended up defeating a gentleman by the name of Alexander Winton, who formed Winton Motor Carriage Company in Ohio. And in fact, in Speedway, there's a street named Winton, and I wonder how many people know where that name came from. But he had been very successful on these little, we're just talking about little 5-mile sprint races at this point. This is 1902. And they basically would have a card of events and have these short races or record trials. And, a lot of these people had never even seen a car before. So it was just fascinating. And anyway, long story short, Barney ended up beating this guy who was seen as the American champion. And that went out on the telegraph wires, and overnight, Barney Oldfield was a star. And he was legitimately busting every track record across the horse track land, and went and ended up hiring him. And he was very successful with that car. But Barney also thought a lot about making money. And while he had legitimate skills and he drove in legitimate races, he also would do the barnstorming. And he's maybe the most famous barnstormer of the era. And Winton frowned on that. He thought that was a mockery and just inappropriate. And he told Barney, I have to let you go, man. And then Barney hooked up with Peerless, and again, the same kind of thing. He would race, and he was awesome. He was the best. And that as the sport matured, you had more guys coming along like Ralph De Palma, and Barney couldn't stand Ralph De Palma because De Palma beat him most of the time they raced. And so that didn't set well with Barney.
Right.
But he was, anytime somebody said, oh, he was just a showman, it's like, well, that's just not the complete story.
Right.
Good enough to have won the Indy 500, Mark.
He might have, but he had a part of his showmanship was that he took on Jack Johnson, the world champion boxer, who fashioned himself to be a race car driver, and he was, dreaming in Technicolor there. But this was after Johnson had defeated Jim Jeffries, and there was so much controversy, and no reason to go into the details, but that era was shocking, even by today's standards. Just the blatant racist cartoons on the funny pages, and the way they referred to blacks and so forth. And so the AAA actually gave Johnson a license. And then somebody said, what did you do that for? He's going to ruin auto racing like he ruined boxing. And so they tried to revoke the license. But Barney thought it'd be a good idea for them to get together. They could make money. And that was what Barney was about. And so they went to the dirt track at Shepherd's Bay and did this thing. Another scheme they had in doing it was like in boxing, they would take these newsreels and then they would have many copies of them and ship them around the country, and they'd play in theaters for a dime. And that was just another way of driving revenue. And so Barney was looking at that. Well, we can sell this to the theaters, and none of that worked out. And the AAA banned him because they were concerned, given the environment, the climate, the attitudes of the day, that he was welcoming a influence that would turn off a lot of the people that wanted to be a part of the sport or just be fans and go to it. So they banned him for 2 years. He came back to run the American Grand Prize that was hosted in Milwaukee on a road course, not the oval. And David Bruce Brown was practicing for that race and was killed. But as it was, even up and including the 50s, the cars might, that you might have a fatal accident, but the car was quickly repairable and you get it back out there with some other guy on it. And so Barney was allowed to replace David Bruce Brown, and that brought him back into the sport. So that was in 1912. So he wasn't even eligible. And my understanding is for 1913, Carl said, I don't want you here. They were buddies, but I don't think that's going to help my business. I don't want you here. So he didn't get to run in 13 either. And he came back in 14 and 15, 14, 15, 16. He only raced in 2 of the races because in 15, he tied one on the night before the race and was just so sick race morning. He turned it over to George Hill, who was his riding mechanic, but had experience racing. So Hill filled in for Barney in 15, or he would have been in that race. Wow. But he finished 5th in his only 2 appearances. And he drove for Stutz in 1914 and was the first American car to finish, because the Europeans came over with a vengeance and just dominated. And they had most of the top 10 and all of the top 4. Sorry to go on and on.
No, we're fascinated by that. And as you were talking, I apologize, 3 others came in too. This has not happened, Mark. This is quite a.
I'll take that as a compliment. Like I said, there's so many nice people out there, and I can tell they're sincerely interested.
Have you had fun doing what you're doing?
Oh, come on.
And you'll come back. One,
Oh, yeah.
You don't have to answer to now, but someone wants to know about Arthur Newby and the Turkey Run State Park. We'll defer that to another time. Okay. Would you like to stay with us to the conclusion? We want to talk.
I'm here to serve. What is this on until 5?
Yeah.
Until the 8 timer times, I guess.
All right. Well, I'll try to. I do have a commitment with my grandson a little later, but I could stay on now. And I just want to say I'm honored. I really appreciate it. And I've admired, I love your Sachs book, Denny, and Bob, your books, and Paul, of course, an icon of broadcasting. So it's truly an honor for me to be here.
Well, I'm not really a tech person, but here to be getting text after text and try to go live on a show and answer that, it's been a challenge. So I don't even know how to edit it out. So you're going to have to be looking at me up and down. But I'm glad that we got that kind of response. I kind of had that gut feeling that with your notoriety in this and the love of the Speedway, the beginnings of it would be important.
I want to just say again, I'm so appreciative of people, and I just couldn't believe how many people will follow me or follow my Facebook page, firstsuperspeedway.com, and First Super Speedway Facebook page, and then firstsuperspeedway.com. I have the Google Analytics on that, and it's amazing how many people, unique visitors, come to it. So there's a real interest in this stuff. Yeah. And the last thing I'll say is evidence of that is my book has outsold Chris Christie's book.
Oh,
that was a low bar, but
did it outsell the Vukovich book? That's Bob Gates's
No. That Bob's legend, and that's going to take a long time to catch up with that. He's
better yet,
about 5
hello,
times.
I'm Paul Page and everything. So
yeah. Now that's
anyway, but we're glad to have you, and maybe you'll consider being a reoccurring guest. Your stories are fascinating, and already we're getting the text of people interested in hearing more stories. Another news story that happened over the weekend, Tony Stewart's Camping World's SRX series. They had the first race of the season down in Pensacola, and a familiar face wins it. Bob, you want to tell a little bit about the opener on CBS?
Yeah, well, this series that Tony Stewart and some other supporters initiated last year just really has had a big impact. And it's surprising to me because really it's kind of the rehashed IROC series. You know, the way which was a great series where you had drivers from many different disciplines in evenly matched cars, or as even as you could make them, competing on different tracks. So evidently it indicates how popular, you know, the old IROC series was, and that theme is picked up with this new series of Stewart's. But it's neat to see some of the you know, IndyCar drivers, Castroneves, Tony Kanaan, others. Paul Page, I think, competes in it. Run not only paved tracks but dirt tracks as well. So anyway, Castroneves won the first race of this series, and of course he climbed the fence in celebration. So
Yeah, that was great.
he
for
left his
television.
mark on that.
Well, here's the top 13 from the main event. Castroneves won it. A local driver that they allowed to compete was Bubba Pollard, finished second. Ryan Newman third.
Yeah.
Tony Kanaan fourth. Bobby LeBounty fifth. Greg Biffle sixth. Marco Andretti seventh.
Yeah.
Ryan Hunter-Ray eighth. Bill Elliott ninth. Tony Stewart finished 10th. Ernie Francis Jr. 11th. Paul Tracy, not Paul Page, finished 12th.
Thank you.
And why don't we see if we can't get Tony? You know, Tony, maybe you can get in that series too, Paul. And Michael Waltrip was 13th. So a bunch of big name IndyCar drivers going, and it's I think he's really going to hit a home run with that. And then the other story out at the Speedway this past weekend was the vintage auto racing thing. Paul, did you have a chance to go out there for that?
No, I did not.
Did you hear any comments out?
I heard a lot of great comments, and of course that was combined with the SVRA, which is a truly amazing series. I mean, Peralta's really put together something there, and he called very early on to come out and take a look at it. And I just, yeah, it's those old cars, a lot of old Indy cars, a lot of new Indy cars. I even saw a shot of one that looked like the Turbine. I don't know if it had a Pratt and Whitney in the back, but it's the kind of day. Unfortunately, I was on my way out to Putnamville to watch run the sprint cars and everything run on dirt. That exhausted me, so I couldn't go Sunday. So.
Well, I thought it was cool on that. You know, I supported Tony Perella in building that event and the whole series. I love Jeff Brabham. He, you know, I remember talking to him. He didn't want to go back. Nah, I'm too old. And I don't know, 5 years ago, he got approached, and his name escapes me right now, but by one of the car owners, and he had a Brabham BT35, I think, 1971. It was Stefan Johansson's team when he won the Swedish Formula B championship. And Jeff won again. He makes a habit of that. So it's just, and Jimmy Vasser was out there in a V.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
you know, and Dennis Firestone, from hanging around SVRA, is that Dennis Firestone? You know, yeah, sure was. I went over and talked to him. And
He's got a little Formula Ford, and he races that all over the place.
He does. He does.
Who does that, Paul? Firestone or Vasser?
Firestone.
Okay, didn't Jimmy Vasser win was that a Formula Ford event he won this weekend?
Oh, I don't know.
I thought it was a Formula V.
Oh, Formula V. Okay. Yeah.
But,
I thought that was pretty cool. See Jimmy Vasser.
Yeah.
He said,
yeah.
made comments to the effect, well, it's not as fast as I've been used to, but he said it's fun to still do it.
Yeah.
If you guys give me a second, I can tell you a great story about Vassar.
Okay.
Go about your business though.
No,
Okay.
love to hear a Vassar story.
So it sounds like we got something special coming up here in a moment when Paul arrives back on the scene. Do you still work with the SVRA?
Yeah,
Mark?
but I've really scaled back, and I wasn't there this weekend. So it's not to curtail ever getting back involved, but I'll be honest with you, I'm just nuts about my grandson. He's a racer. I didn't brainwash him. This kid came out of mama, and I think the third word he learned after mama and dada was race car. And that's just been the way he is. You go through the Speedway Museum with him and he just goes nuts. And he's 5 years old.
Wow.
We took him to his first Indy 500 this year and he sat through the whole thing.
Did he?
And guess what? He calls me Pop Pop. That was my 50th Indy 500. So that was a cool
Oh yeah,
set of milestones.
absolutely.
Okay, so Jimmy Vassar, the kart champion in 1996. And I was going to host the victory banquet for him. And that was when they had the FedEx Cup. And all the names were on the base of the FedEx Cup, not unlike the BorgWarner Trophy. And we were rehearsing, and I walked over the trophy and I looked at it. And I said, guys, you misspelled Jimmy Vassar's name. And they, oh my, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? Well, they, in a very short period of time, got a new plaque properly done. But this is that's it kind of hung on the trophy that way, and this was the one that was. Can you see that? It's spelled.
Yeah, bring it. There we
There you
go.
go.
I
There
see
you
it now.
go.
That's good.
Yeah. There
I'll
you
be
go.
darned.
Yeah, that's what my collection is all about. Weird stuff.
That's the most interesting stuff a lot of times.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So kind of a sad note, the passing of Eldon Rasmussen, who died this past week, three-time starter in the Indianapolis 500, even more acclaimed as a fabricator and some of the more the building of the automobiles. Paul, how well did you know Eldon?
I knew Eldon fairly well. There is a photograph. We were at Pocono and I wasn't doing any broadcasting, so I got on one of the emergency trucks because I was also a paramedic, and Eldon crashed. And at one of my great photos out of that era is me standing there with Eldon over his crashed car at Pocono. But he did, as you said, a lot of fabricating, and he was really good at it. He was really expensive, but he was really, really good. In fact, he was the guy that took care of my Formula Ford every time I decided to drive it in some different place. Yeah, and of course we lost Johnny Caples too.
Yes.
Oh, I didn't. That's too bad. Bob, you have Eldon Rasmussen stories?
Well, he just was just an all-around good guy. And he was maybe the last of the guys that would put together an effort, on a shoestring budget, doing most of the work himself, or fabricating and all those types of things, and make the 500. He's probably one of the last that did it that way. So that made him pretty special in itself. But just a good guy, could always tell some great stories, always enjoyed talking to people. And if you ran into Eldon somewhere and struck up a conversation, you might as well plan on being there for a bit. But always entertaining.
I don't know if he really liked this or not, but I kind of call him a Jimmy Carter lookalike. And he had a bit of a Jimmy Carter and maybe a little bit of his smile on everything as well. So Mark, what we have been doing, we first did our salute to the four-time winners. And then last episode, we started on the 3-time Indy 500 winners with Dario Franchitti. And this episode is going to be focused on Johnny Rutherford, but because of the dynamicness of your show and you're being a part of it, we're going to kind of defer that to the next time. And Paul Rutherford.
I bumped Johnny Rutherford.
Yes,
Can I say that?
Basically, yeah.
But Paul, you're going to love this because we're going to talk about Rutherford's wins in 74, 76, and in 80. And there's something special happened in 1974 as far as radio broadcast, and we'll let you tell about all that excitement on our next episode. And looking ahead too, as we do our 3-time winners, and I can hardly wait for this to happen when we do Bobby Unser, and it's going to be Paul Page unfiltered, telling stories about Uncle Bobby that's probably never been shared or little mentioned and everything like that. That'll come in a couple of
One of my best friends. Yep. And he was a miracle.
And it was to this day, I don't know what was better, Don Meredith and Howard Cosell, or Bobby Unser and Sam Posey, or
That was an era.
But anyway, Mark, hopefully you had fun again, and
I had a wonderful time.
that you'll come and join us again.
Anytime, guys.
With that being said, this is Denny Miller from Indy 500 Yesteryear and Today with Speedway Insiders Paul Page and Bob Gates, and we wish you Godspeed and take care now. God bless. Bye-bye.